Okay, welcome Sky, and thank you so much for joining us for this conversation at Kunstnernes Hus Cinema. And thanks to everybody who came out for this conversation. So my name is Sara, and I'm gonna host this conversation, and we're thinking of it as we will try to make it a little bit of a more informal and communal conversation. So I would invite the audience to just jump in when you feel like you have a comment or a question, something you want to share with Sky and us. But I thought first I would start off with a few questions to you. And first of all, thank you for such a wonderful film. It was a truly amazing experience to see it here in a theater, and to be in a theater. I haven't been actually for a year and a half, I just realized. So I would like to just start with actually the opening sequence of the film, Małni, towards the ocean, towards the shore. And I'm really struck by the way you structure the opening and the edit of the opening sequence, starting off with this. I'm gonna straighten up a bit. Wait, oh, and that doesn't work. Maybe is it okay if you just hear my voice? Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So yeah, I want to start with the opening sequence and this still image or a static image of the ocean, and then you cut to this handheld or maybe a Steadicam moving through the forest, and we're following Jordan, who we would later get to know. And then you cut back to this hotel room with a view of the ocean. And I think it's Sweetwater who enters the room and stands at the balcony, looks at the ocean, and then turns towards you. And the camera starts to move handheld towards the balcony and ends up looking at the ocean. And I just think it's such a beautiful opening sequence, and it also kind of points to how I experienced the entire structure of the film as being this constant fluidity between a staticness and a stillness, and a shift between perspectives and also sights, and I guess also times. And it feels that it points to the cyclical that I experienced that goes through the entire film. So I just wanted to start off with that kind of reflection about the opening sequence and yeah, hear how you're thinking about the beginning of the film.
I was looking for a way to introduce both Sweetwater and Jordan, as well as the ocean, through the opening. And even as I was thinking about how to try and structure the film with following each of these two people, and also the meteorites and myself as the narrator, as the voiceover, it just felt like a really nice way to introduce three of the tenets of the film: Jordan, Sweetwater, and the ocean. And the shots of the ocean with Sweetwater, that was, I think, the second or third thing that I'd filmed for the project, when I was just doing some camera tests with Sweetwater and we were just like hanging out. And yeah, just like I had the camera running, pointed at the ocean, and it was just one of those things where she walked in frame, and then I was like, hey, walk towards me, and I picked that camera up and walked to the balcony. So there was, I don't know, something very natural about that sequence of events that I think really helps establish what the tone is of the film, about how I am very much a part of the scenery, a part of these lives, and also the person behind the camera. And I'm moving to the space with you, the viewer, and I'm following Jordan, I'm following Sweetwater, and looking at the ocean in a way that's hopefully enhances or underscores the sort of liminal space that it is between life and death, or between the spirit world and the land of the living.
Thank you. And about that, because I understand there is this link between the ocean and the life of the spiritual life or the afterlife. And you also touch upon that in a beautiful short film called Lore, that I got to see on your website. And could you talk a bit more about that that concept of what the ocean means to you? Yeah, and how that plays out through the film.
Yeah, again, like with this film, it's in Chinookan belief, it is like the shoreline, the ocean is the space between the land of the living and land of the dead. And as the film looks at, or as I'm looking at this origin of death myth, or thinking about reincarnation, or thinking about the afterlife and death, I feel like it is a place to center the conversation or to have it revolve around. And even looking at myth, which what I've done in previous short films that I've made that are a bit more focused on either like a ho chunk belief around it, which is my tribe, or a broader sort of relationship to myth, which is about the creation of new myths. And like this film isn't necessarily trying to create a new myth, but looking at or even like retell the myth, though there is that section that I have in the film where I'm telling the origin of death myth as was told to Mount Hudson. There's a certain sort of way of looking at the myth and not trying to reenact it, but rather looking at the effects that it has on people that are living right now, living today, such as Sweetwater and Jordan, who have questions of their own about these things.
Just a question to this idea of the myth, because I read an interview you did with a Norwegian journalist that was published the other day in Klassekampen, and you talk about a fascination for Apichatpong as a filmmaker. And I remember I read an interview with him where he said that a myth could also be something that can function as a kind of an oppressive tool as well, as a fixture of old ideas. I'm just curious to, because I don't see that in the way you are dealing with myths, but have you reflected upon that?
The camera as an oppressive tool?
A myth. The myth could also be like an oppressive structure. It was just something I read by Apichatpong that he was saying in an interview, that because he also deals a lot with myth in his films, but also, I mean, how the myth, I mean, can have different functions, but also kind of keep people also locked into certain beliefs of the past.
No, absolutely. I mean, like my concern with myth is that they're like for indigenous people in the United States specifically, as they were documented 100 years ago by anthropologists, ethnographers, etc., that also began, an era, or was a continuation of an era of forced assimilation and genocide. So there's different concerns around myth, I think, from these different sort of cultural perspectives and historical ones. And as my interest in myth is about that sort of stagnation, about as these myths were documented 100 years ago, they were then like written in stone, as it were, where they weren't changing, they weren't adapting, they weren't evolving to suit the people that were for whom they belong. And then I think that's a key difference there, like where we are searching for a way to reclaim myths from these books, from these academics, from these anthropologists, ethnographers who hold those myths, hold those stories as they existed 100 years ago as the most authentic version of us, and everything else is not as authentic or less than our ancestors. And that's insanely, hugely damaging for the psyche of a people, the psyche of a community. And so what my interest in is to try to claim some sort of agency around our relationship to these myths, some sort of ownership to them, to change them, to have them adapt and to grow and to be more relevant, or to continue to be relevant to the people for whom they were told or designed to, or who made them. So I think that's a key difference, but also like, I mean, there is something to the stagnation of myth as well as the stagnation of language that I am resistant to. Languages always change and evolve and adapt. Same thing with myths and same thing with stories, but it's definitely up to the people to be part of that change.
Thank you for sharing that. And there's also a comment in the film, I think, when you the first time or the second time you recite the Talapus and Lily myth, and you said that's how I at least remember it, or that's you kind of open it up at the end of the sentence. Keeping it not stagnant. Anybody who has anything on this topic of myth that they would like to throw in, a reflection, a question? Well, we can keep going and we see slowly. I'm just curious about one thing, because there's one word, because now I've seen your film a couple of times, and there's one word that I keep kind of noticing, and this that Jordan is speaking in the Chinookan language, and it's dum-dum. I don't know if I pronounce it correctly, but it's when I'm looking at the translation, it's like sometimes it's I feel, I think, sometimes it's heart. It's just an observation, but could you speak to that, because you have this interest in translation and the language?
Yeah, I mean, it is a core word that a lot of other compounds and context is built around, but the heart of it really is this sort of word for feeling, which is comes from like an onomatopoeic sort of way of the heart, of the beating of the heart. And so the things that you feel in your chest, the things that you feel like here, you know? So yeah, it is a word that is used often, but also conveys a lot of different meanings based on the compounds that it's attached to and the context within the sentence.
Okay, thank you. I found it interesting that it was mixed between this thinking and feeling when I was watching it, and coming from this more, Cartesian idea and this division between the mind and the body. I liked how it was. Yeah, I understood it as more fluid than that. And to continue on the language and the voice, which is so present in the film, and also how you work with sounds. Or maybe I'll start with the sound, because I find it also very interesting how the sound of water keeps moving through different imagery, and also ties together different imagery. And sometimes I see an image and the sound doesn't follow, or the sound belongs to another image, it feels a bit like. So you kind of break my expectations of what I am to see with a sound over and over, and it kind of creates more of a tactile and sensorial experience of the entire film. So I'm just wondering how you work with sound, how you think around sound, and through this also the voice.
The soundscape in this film really gave me a way to think about abstraction without abstracting the images. Like with my short films, I tend to go back and forth with a lot of visual abstractions, like overlaying images, looking at artifacts within like the sensor of the camera or whatever. And with this film, I really didn't want to do a lot of that. I didn't want to do a lot of sort of overlays and filters and abstractions. I wanted the image to be clear as it could be, I suppose, and really use color and sound as a way to heighten the sort of sense of reality or create a sense of surreality. And it was, it was trying also to, I mean, out of the practical sense, like I was shooting sync sound, but often like I would be shooting with my camera and not have a microphone with me that was better quality. And so oftentimes the sound on my camera wasn't that great. So I ended up just pulling different soundscapes from different places and combining them to make something that's, had a sort of left and right channel feel to it, or a surround like feel, or abstracted through the use of delays and reverbs and equalization within the score. And so playing with that a bit throughout the film, I wanted it to be abstracted, or just to create an abstracted sort of space of your understanding of it, where it isn't necessarily, this is what this place is like, this is what Washington State is like in the United States and the Puget Sounds, but rather to constantly question the time and place and the location of the story and of these people and of where we were, to make it a bit mythical, I suppose.
Because you mentioned in the beginning that there's 3 characters. You have Jordan, Sweetwater, and the ocean as the primary characters. And sometimes I just noticed that when Sweetwater is talking, and as you say, maybe it was because the sound wasn't that good, but it's sometimes you overlay her talking with the sound of the ocean, which I think works really beautifully. And breaks down a hierarchy in a way between the human voice and the voice of nature. If I can, if that sounds okay, the voice of nature, I'm not sure. So to continue with the voiceover, and you're also working as a poet, and how in particular with this film, did you work with the text, like writing the voice versus doing the shootings? What are the order of things when you work on a project like this?
First I was shooting. I think I was just trying to get enough footage to figure out when I could start editing. Because like I didn't really know when was enough for this. So there came a point where I think I had about the first 20 or 30 minutes of it put together, first 20 minutes. And I really just like, what is this film gonna look like? I have no idea. It's starting to get pretty stressful. And so, I mean, putting that first 20 minutes together, which is pretty much the first 20 minutes of the film as you see now, there's a few changes, but it was this sort of opening sequence and this introduction of Sweetwater and Jordan and the ocean and the meteorites. And having those on the screen or on the timeline as I was editing was what was a way to try and, I don't know, put it together. I don't know, like, I had a really hard time figuring out, do I write the voiceover in Chinook first? Do I write it in English and translate it to Chinook? Nothing really felt natural. I mean, I'm a lot better speaker than I am a writer with it, and I don't have the right keyboard to type with it, so it's frustrating in some ways. And so what I ended up doing was just like watching the first 20 minutes, and like I had my phone and like the voice recorder, and I just started talking over it in Chinook. And basically what you hear is me talking over the, I only did 2 recordings. The first one I did on my phone, and then I had to do it over again because it's really bad quality with the proper microphone. And then I just pretty much like kept it the same. And there's a few instances throughout where you hear the original recording on my phone. But yeah, I was just like responding to the images and responding to what was going on. And in a sense, just like talking through it and just kind of saying whatever came to mind. And that's pretty much how the text was written, or the voiceover was conceived.
Okay, great. And your relation to the Chinook language, because you learned it a bit later in life, is that correct?
Not that late.
Not that late. Yeah.
Yeah. I forgot how old I was. I guess about 10 years ago now, 10 or 12 years ago.
But you've also been teaching it, right? Or can you talk a bit about the relationship you have to the language?
Yeah, I started learning it in 2010, I believe, 2010 or 11. And it was at the same time that I started making films or picking up a camera and trying to learn how to use it and edit. So very much like my filmmaking practice is tied to my language teaching and learning. And the thing that made it really accessible to me or interesting to me learning this language was just the method and the person that had taught me, who was Evan Gardner. And he like invented this whole system for teaching and learning language. And so like that's like the way that he taught me. And so that's how I organized language classes and language nights at my university, Portland State. And through that, so I taught Jordan Chinook and a few other people. And yeah, it really has been an important part of my life. And I think in the time that I started learning Chinook, while it was a very difficult time in my life. So it's nice to have this as a way to help get me out of some tricky situations and to find a way to make work and to make films and to also teach. So yeah, I feel like the last 10, 12 years of my life have been pretty much built upon the teaching and learning of Chinook as well as making movies.
And there is this constant fluidity between the languages in the film, and I think, as I understand it, Jordan speaks more Chinook now, and Sweetwater talks more in English throughout the film, and then the intertitles or the titles sometimes are in both languages. And you also mentioned at some point, I don't know, ocean, but as the place in between. And also in another of your short films that I watched that was called Lost in the Rain, you also more directly kind of address this about the space in between, and you also mention between two cultures in that film, which is a film from the border of Mexico and the US. But the main person talks about the constant role as a visitor or outsider. She uses both words. Would you like to talk about that in relationship to this film?
Yeah, would I? Yeah, I would. with
Or is that a really outsider question?
no, I mean, I was thinking about how do I, or well, I guess it begins with a question of like, I mean, where do I fit in? Like my tribe is from Wisconsin, which is like the Midwest, the United States, but I was born in on Washington State, which is like 2,000 miles away from and my mom's tribe is from Southern California, so that's another 1,000 miles away, you know. So there's a lot of like big geographic distances, cultural differences. Like the tribes in the Northwest are completely separate and different from the tribes in California or Wisconsin. And so growing up there, I was always aware of the differences of myself, of my tribal background and the tribal homelands that I was living in. And I mean, I have family that are from these tribes, but I'm also not. I'm also a guest. I'm also a visitor. And so as I moved around to these different places throughout the United States throughout my life, whether it was back to California or to Oregon or to Washington or to Wisconsin, I was always aware or was thinking about the role of being a guest on these different homelands. And just as like I am not an expert on all tribes in the United States, there's 567 federally recognized tribes in the US, give or take. And that's a lot of different cultures, it's a lot of different languages and beliefs. So those are the things that I was thinking about, especially with a film like When You're Lost in the Rain, which is a rumination on being a guest and being a visitor in these sort of liminal spaces in between a home and a place that you live, a place that you're visiting. And similarly with Mothni, it's a film that is from the place that I lived most of my life, you know, in Washington and in Oregon, around this culture most of my life. And so I do try to, or have been trying to treat it with care and respect. And I hope that that shows through the film, and also just like the ways that, you know, I've tried to not necessarily position myself or position the film as being an authoritative sort of text or an authoritative sort of documents about the language, about the culture, about the people, but rather it is a cursory sort of look into this culture, into this community, where a lot of the signifiers, a lot of the things that are going on aren't necessarily given access to the audience if they're not from that community. But also you can still watch it, you can still experience it, and you have a sense of what these things are. The details, again, are protected, which goes back to, like, you know, the conversation around myth and anthropologists and ethnographers. Not that I have anything against them, but there is a certain sort of like gatekeeping that happens between us and our own cultures, and also the sort of exploitation that happens with cultures and things that should be, I don't know, private, that aren't.
Thank you. Anybody who wants to jump in here or ask some questions, comments? It's a really interesting audience here with a lot of filmmakers, artists. Yeah, yes.
Could you please use this microphone? I think it's easier for me to do. I thought it was very remarkable the use of subtitles. The fact that you subtitle the English into Chinook, presupposing an audience that will read that. So I was just wondering if this is a poetic gesture, or you were really meaning your film to be mainly addressed to Chinook speakers. Because of course, it's, for me, it's quite fascinating to see it written, to see the way it is spoken, but it doesn't have any use. I don't understand it. And so I was wondering why the gesture of subtitling the English into Chinook, if this was a poetic gesture or it was a practical, or maybe they were both. That was my question.
I would say all the above. Originally, the film was conceived as having Jordan and the entire film being Chinook. And Sweetwater is a good friend of mine. Like, I've known her for like 15 years. And I was visiting Oregon to do some test shooting and to do some location scouting and to try out this gimbal, whatever. And through that, she, she was working as a flight attendant. And so like our paths finally crossed, and I'm like, oh, let's hang out for a day. And so we drove to the coast and did some shooting, and that's how she ended up in the film. But she doesn't speak Chinook. And I was trying to figure out, what do I do? Do I teach her Chinook? It's not a lot of time. Do I translate what she says into Chinook and have her say it back? That's too awkward and not really true to how I work, and also a lot of work. And so ultimately, I just felt the simplest solution was the best one, which is just to have her speak English. It's the language that she speaks. And that got me thinking a lot about the sort of hierarchies that are placed on Indigenous language learning. Like, I felt a lot of shame growing up because I didn't speak Ho-Chunk or Pachanga, and the only language that I knew was English. And it took me a lot of years to work through that. And I see a lot of that with students that I've had, the sort of shame that you don't speak your native language, you don't speak your heritage language. And I don't want people to feel shame. And I didn't want to feel shame for that. And so trying to impose Chinook on Sweetwater just felt like a perpetuation of that sort of shame making and shame giving. And I also felt this was an opportunity to look at the film and see what it looks like to subtitle it in Chinook, even as this might, function as something a resource for Chinook language learners or something. And to imagine that there is an audience whose subtitles are needed, that's their audience matters, like there may be like 100 to 500 speakers of Chinook, and this is for them. This is for that audience that can do that. And so they can read this or speak this. And there's a way to pull Chinook from the margins, or just Indigenous language from the margins, is like, there's no audience for this, so then why do we need these sorts of accessibility like tools? And I think like finally it was a way to flatten the hierarchy between Chinook and English. So I treat Chinook the exact same way that I treat English in the film. So I subtitle everything that's in Chinook into English, and I subtitle everything that's in English to Chinook. And the moments like where, the sound is inaudible or you can't quite hear what they're saying, I subtitle it with both, just to try and treat it as flatly as I can. So it's a bit of a poetic move, but it's also a bit of a practical one. And it's also a bit of a statement as well.
Okay, I have one more question. Back to the cyclical and with regards to time. And maybe I think about this, especially in the stories that Sweetwater, she's talking about that she's in her second trimester, and she is soon to give birth, and she talks about her grandmother and the presence of her grandmother and her mother and then herself. And it really feels like the film, and the way it also shifts between locations, between how the sound brings together these different locations, how the sound also, through these different times, planes of times, and the way you kind of interweave the whole film together between these different moments. And thinking about this story that Sweetwater is talking about her grandmother, it feels that the time is very non-linear in your film, and in the story you're telling. Would you like to share some reflections with us on time?
Yeah, while assembling the film, I realized I really had no interest in trying to make a cohesive narrative, like a linear narrative, or following the sort of story from beginning to end. And like I've described the film as a sort of like spiral, or maybe like a sloppy spiral, like it's thinking about time in that sort of way, as it repeats itself, and it also is moving forward or moving backward, or whichever direction you think about. And as the film is more, I guess, like this sort of strategy that I was going for while editing and assembling these different sequences, that was more intuitive, or just like what felt like a beginning, what felt like a middle, and what felt like an end, as opposed to any sort of logic around linear time. And it was freeing to follow that sort of a path of trying to edit and assemble, because like there's moments where Sweetwater is referencing the first waterfall cleanse, and that was the thing that you see at the very end of the film. And so I didn't necessarily want to highlight the sort of shifts or breaks in time or linear sort of space, but rather just have it seem natural and fluid as possible. And if you notice it, then it's something to think about or reflect upon, like the sort of space or the different times that these people occupy, whether it's Sweetwater or Jordan or myself or the meteorite. And it was, I don't know, something that I felt like, I don't know if I could even have made it linear. Maybe. I would have got bored with it.
I think it's also interesting. It's a point you mentioned between now and nowhere, which is also between now, which is time, and nowhere, which I think of as place, and how it's just seems to be two things of the same in a way, or considered on the same plane. That was interesting.
That was like, I mean, more of a, I don't know, a discovery of Chinook, I guess. I mean, like, as I said it, I went and translated it, and I was like, oh, this can be translated in a number of different ways, and what does it really mean, you know? And so that was one of those things that just came about through thinking about the language, or how it can be contextualized through English, or rather not necessarily trying to translate, but rather interpret.
And let's see if we have a final round of questions here. Or rounds, maybe an exaggeration, but if not, I think we will round this up with you reading a bit from your book, Perfidia. Is that correct, the title?
Yeah.
Yes. We are very eager to hear you read from the book. Last chance questions? No? No.
Sorry, I forgot. Yeah. So like what, 5 minutes or so?
Sorry?
All right. I'll start at the beginning. This is a collection of poems or cantos or writings that I've been working on for a number of years, and they found their way into a few different films. One was called Cloudless Blue Egrets of Summer, which is a 2-channel installation and video installation, and another film called Lore, where bulk of the text exists, and a series of photographs that I made. So it's sort of like spiral or web of works that I'd like to think through. And so it was cool to have this get published on the occasion of an exhibition here in New York. But this is called Perfidia. This is the beginning that isn't the beginning. This is the youth, oh youth, and Franklin said, so what? Betrayal was acknowledged when Emerson wrote a letter to Van Buren and warned that his seed and seal would become an instrument of perfidy. It was neither the first nor the last in this country, this body of earth. But I didn't forget about you, our love, as we moved on and away back across the ocean, back across the sea, back across the spirit world into the land of the dead. Back to Castile and Aragon, where you don't think of we anymore. You've neglected our pain, you've ignored our children, you discarded our dead. Back to King Louis because you're the same. You've tussled our hair and torn out our trust and pushed us away and sold us out. Back to King George. You've taken our things and won't give them back. You came and you took and you made promises that sing and gave us a tongue bitter in taste, parched and thirsty. Broad Europe, you remain over there. You've forgotten my mother, my father, and my brother and sister who mourn every day. But we can't forget you, as your violent emissaries remain. I'm not mad, I'm not angry, I'm not hurt. I'm just deeply troubled at heart. Maybe I'm lying. Maybe these words that follow are a way, not the only way, not the right way, not a good way, but an empty way. Voided by language, voided by absence, void of trust. A hollow way being filled by those traumas I never wanted to be taught. Still, this earthly trauma begins with you. There you are, and hello, here I am with this. This is the by and by, and often the hours slide slowly along, gliding and gleaming after each day is done. Dark and tangled, and the strided Cyrus miles above and to the west. Toward the ocean, where the boundaries of the world meet and death is again negotiated in the dusk, then drawn into dawn. Towards the shore we go, lost in life and less certain of death, with which is lessened by age and abundance. Back in the water, the dark water, the caps are whitened by the wind and the waves as they feed into each other. Back to the interior, we are on the beach and on the sands. Who is to say that east or west matter anymore when given directions such as Mafini? This is the shore. This is the beginning. This is our youth. The Eidos of Lilu gives way to the capriciousness of Talapas returning from a voyage. Beyond the ocean, beyond, the outer frontier of childhood and memories, escaping between then and now, abscissa floating freely along an indefinite plane, dislocated and ordinary. With this one more, one.
Yes, please.
Okay, this one. This is the outside, being here right now where we said goodbye. For me, I didn't believe myself. In the dark and the deep and the light in the morning, alone, lonely. Coffee steamed for a while, blown by the heater. The light was blue and so were you, lying there, sleeping, breathing underneath creamy blankets, stirring and snoring every now and then. Waking early and wandering around the maze of floors, pattering and puttering, watering plants forgotten last week, and stopping for a moment and reflecting on the stillness of this space. I haven't been here for some time now. I'm usually absent somewhere on some kind of float, drifting along the currents, never still but halcyon nonetheless, as the foliage slowly slips by, breezy and charmed. Downward, upward, around and round the spinning whirl, pooled at the bottom of all those expectations. You woke and said bye, farewell to me and to we, and to the sound of dragon slippers on autumn mornings, rustling and tender, quietly effusing feelings of affection and resignation. I walked in straight lines and turned around and around, thinking this think, and thought how terrible I can be on the cooler side of all this. Just terrible, just cold. Feeling it and feeling sorry, so sorry, I'm sorry. I retreat and repeat the phrase over and again. I killed a spider last night, and I apologized in earnest. My grandma was a spider, and her kin are mine. Easy steps around a post on apartments, nothing to do and nowhere to be, other than in the tranquility of an in-between, emotionally equidistant from what was and what could have been. Like sunrise and dusk, the light is better here, but only for a time. Either waiting for the shadows to rise and fall from collected objects, or to scale and conquer dematop peaks, summited and flagged every day.
Thank you so much, Sky. We will end it on that. And really super glad to have you with us for a conversation. And thank you for this wonderful film. And I think the Artist House will be selling your book. Yes?
It's a bit late. It should have been before the screening. It's not. We're expecting it on Monday. So 10 very exclusive copies. Just contact me and I'll give you.
I don't know if you heard that, Sky, but yeah, we will have 10 copies for sale. So thank you so much, and thanks everybody for coming, and looking forward to see your next projects in the future. And have a good day in New York. Thank you.